Welcome back from that break, and it's good to know that you have rejoined us again on the program. Good morning, Abuja, showing only on the Unity Station NTA Channel 5, Abuja. And on to my very first conversation on the program this morning, we are going to look at mitigating flood in the FCT, and I have a town planner with me here in the studio. Help me welcome Abubakar Sadiq Ahmed. Abubakar, you're welcome to the program.
Thank you. Good to have me.
All right, you're welcome. You know, the issue of flood, we have to keep talking about it. It's no longer a news, but we have to keep creating the awareness. Now, let's start this way. What are really the causes of flooding in the FCT, and how have they evolved over time?
On a very sincere note, flooding, as we know, is a disaster that have a two-phase. Either it's a natural thing or it's man-made. As a result of the scenario or the scene of flood, mostly in FCT, report and correspondents always take it as flash floods. But I knew in 2005, 2006, during the Erufai administration, there were serious checkments on issues of the fragile points. That is the floodplains identifications, which were made around Abuja. And what it did at that time was mostly go around and see where runaways, pathways, and drainages are supposed to curtail issues where rains flow. Because flood is a disaster that actually comes with the amount of the rain collected from the top. And how it comes is, naturally, if there are tributaries or channels at which this water flow, it's definitely not going to be a problem. But situations where rain comes and all of the tributaries, or where the rains channel are supposed to be, are taken over by development and co, then the resulting part is that it gives a flood and it flush away either properties, lives are involved. Of greater concern, the causes of flood within the FCT, wherever positions you're taking it, more especially the pronounced ones were that of Lokogoma in 2019, the one that flooded the houses, and that of September 12th in Trademore Junction and Trademore Estate cost about 4 lost of life, and that of September and June 24th this year again. We take emphasis on this because they have a direct bearing to what the man-made situation that trigger these issues. One of it is that prominently within the FCT, even if it's against the law, you see lots of people building below or on a low land size below the road level. And naturally, if you have a building below at the low lands, that is below the infrastructural level, if water drop on the floor and it goes down directly, automatically it's flowed the area concerned. And again, once you're not taking that, the flow of the water and the channel of the tributaries or the collector where the water are supposed to flow as drainage, are they made sufficiently enough to carry the water when it flows or when it falls? When it is a heavy downfall and they are not adequate channel at which water flow, water will definitely find a way to flow. And the resultant of it is the one we have at Galadima Junction, if you remember 2018, that flush away around the intersects from the Galadima Junction that leads to Sun City, Sunnyvale. At that place, it was so serious because you could remember a lot of cars got missing, that at the end of the day, we knew that all of these things were caused by more of a man-made than it's natural. Rain definitely fall, but the resultant part that the parts at which the water is supposed to flow is being taken over by events and development. So issues of concern with these consultative agencies that day by day it keep getting serious, because the more you slim the channel at which the water flow from the top, the more it have a resultant on the extended development. And I think of late, that is why the victims of such kind of situations have always been trade more, happen to be also in a place that, whether it's seated on the floodplain, the lowland as well. So it has two disadvantages of the difficult terrain that is not being properly managed.
Okay. Now that you talked about the causes, either they are man-made or natural, no? As a town planner, let's talk about infrastructure this time around. Explain to us the importance of effective urban planning and infrastructure development in flood mitigation, especially here in the FCT.
Yeah, very well. You see, in design concept as a town planner, the first thing that takes in consideration is, after the road, which is the circulation in the layout design, the next thing to take consideration is the infrastructural provisions of the waterways and the seawall collectors. All of the infrastructures are supposed to come. They are supposed to be pre-planned. Like, okay, it comes with the planning of an estate, but the reverse is the case. When you check out all of the estates that are coming up, you realize that the infrastructure is not given emphasis to as the building of the estate and what is to be made out of it. Whether the infrastructure is purely government or partially private, this is another question for another topic for another day. But basically, if those infrastructures are served alongside the developmental stride, it will curtail to a larger extent the number of flood we have in FCT, because you see lots of district coming up, and the next thing you see, whether if careful is not given, most of them are concentrating more. They will think of, okay, let's do a road, whether the road is up to standard, how does it relate to the development of the estate, is another thing that the planning are mostly not involved in the elementary design process in FCT, because the road designs are handled mostly by engineers. If only planners have input and such doing, they could determine where and when and where to place those where to channel water naturally. Because if you go to any site as a town planner, you can identify naturally where water find ways to move regardless. So if you're involving the town planner in a design, what he tends to do is like, okay, this attribute, this access shouldn't be made available for anything that has to do with development. This should be a way to path infrastructural ways, or do a channel or culverts that are going to be enough to curtail the water, assumably in the volume at which the trend of what you see that path the way will tell you how the rain or how the water could be sustained in such, whether using stone pitch or doing a very typical culvert that will not be also resultant to erosion eating up some part of it, because there are two effects that have a side effect to each other. Is a disaster that could lead to another one. Definitely, even if the drainages and the system to control it is not properly channeled, at the end of the day, you will still going to have a repetition of what you have to do. But like I said, what is much more very alarming and worrying in the whole of the flood issue in FCT is that most of developers, both private, estate, have compromised standard at which to, and they're yearning and aspirations to own more land in order to acquire more spaces to have additional houses. They do a retaining wall. When they do a retaining wall, naturally they have blocked an access that water was naturally flowing. And when you do a retaining wall in the name of trying to portray, have more money, at the end of the day, you subject almost the whole of the estate to that disaster when it happens.
Okay, thank you very much. Now that the problem is here, it's everybody's involvement. Now let's talk about how can community involvement and awareness play a role in flood prevention?
It's a big one. Unfortunately, true for the occurring parts where you keep having this occurrence, the enforcement level might not be too pleasant for the people to hear, which because it has to do with the involvement of creating ways for the water. And creating ways for the water is still going to the natural cause of what we have avoided at the beginning and having ways for the water to go. And some of the estate that are sitting on the floodplain have to go if it is the only situation, because you can preempt the fact that he who fails to plan to fail repeatedly.
Sure.
So for a planner, the only way to resolve the issue of having an everlasting or a long-lasting solutions to this flood is having to do what you ought to do at the first. That was the reason that was avoided that caused the flood will have to be adhered to, even if it has through enforcement of serious standards, thereby taking off some buildings and making sure that the aim at which the buildings are taken, because with the FCT administration, it has always been like a concern when you try to avoid a revoke on the form of, okay, there's a disaster, so we have taken off this these structures. And yet again, another set of people will come and say they want, maybe because they are close to the system, and they tend to get that same thing in the name of they are coming to control what has been the problem.
Thank you very much. Now, how can sustainable land use practice and green infrastructure contribute to flood mitigation?
You see, when you bring about the the sustainable land use, the FCT itself, when it was brought about, it was actually emphasized as a garden city.
Garden city,
and the garden city, it's a concept that is actually more green, but in the recent time, it is more of a brown than a green in percentage coverage. Even with the swap systems, whether it was a land swap or a green swap, swapping green for land for brown. So in developmental wise and going with the professional bodies, I think it's high time we call a spade and calling standards to it, because without those sustainable standards of adhering to green and knowing that developing outward of the city center could curtail these problems, like dwelling, everybody wants to stay in the city center, so he doesn't he's not mindful of whatever that is meant to him, whether it is green, whether it is blue. It's actually a river in the coloration of the land uses. So all of this land uses has to be devised, and also of a managerial concern where urban and regional planning and the AGs, the Abuja Geographical Information System, had to work hand in hand, because you can't just allocate a land that you are not in cognizance with the surrounding situation. It's also a problem, because sometimes when you apply for land, you apply visibility and viability report. But I wonder whether due diligence are done to notice that, okay, you give person land and the next thing you check, you're awarded a land with ages, and the next thing you go to check and you see that the land between you and the where you're given to is just a river or a floodplain at the river edge. And all of those areas, by the time you're given this, you definitely know that there's a concern. Or going some part in Maitama, there's a ditch, obviously, and it has a location, and you see somebody have a location, and obviously you have those things, and you keep wondering whether it is highly checked before it was recommended for approval.
Well, this is a very big eye-opener for all of us and whoever is listening to us right now. But before I let you go in a way of advice and your final word, what steps can individuals and communities take to protect themselves and their properties?
Today I actually, if you notice, I didn't actually dwell on the issues of the ones that are made by people, because environmental protection but have to take also cognizance of where people make it a habit to look at water waste and go and make it a permanent refuse dump site. That also causes it, because by the time you keep blocking, they don't get to leave those dump site that they artificially created, whereas in the whole of the design, they are permanent dump site where you dump site. But when you make habit of coming because you see there's a hole where water follows, you keep dumping, that should be avoided. That's from the people side. And that indiscriminate dropping of bin unknowingly into even smaller channels of drainages, you see, it also contributes because, like I said, water is a natural cause, and when it falls, if it's a downpour, it's much, it will definitely find a way. And finally, of the design concern, people should adhere to the DPC level that are always given on the less infrastructure side by the Development Control Survey Units. They've always make it a most that you adhere to a standard level at which your DPC should reach, so as to augment the number of below standard of what you have. Then when you have such, it will go a long way in also curtailing the issue of building below the road infrastructural level.
Thank you so much for this wonderful information you gave us on the program. We do really appreciate your time.
Thank you.
All right. Yes, we have been talking with Abubakar Sadiq Ahmed, and he is a town planner. Together, we looked at mitigating flood, especially here in the FCT. Now we're going to go on this musical break. When we return, the program continues. Stay with us, please.